The Asia-Pacific region suffers more from natural disasters than any other place on Earth. In the last few days, yet another typhoon devastated much of the southern Philippines. But just what are the economic implications of all this destruction, and what can be done to better protect people from these recurrent disasters? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Typhoon Bopha has once again thrown a spotlight on Asia's vulnerability to massive natural disasters. The typhoon has killed at least 700 people in the southern Philippines, and rescuers are searching for another 800, many of them deep-sea fishermen who are listed as missing. A new UN report bears out that vulnerability. It says Asia suffers from more natural disasters than anywhere else in the world, and though the number of people who die from disasters is down, the economic impact continues to be significant. Scott Heidler has more from Bangkok.
The Asia-Pacific region is the global hotspot for natural disasters. More earthquakes, more storms, and more floods than anywhere else in the world. And according to the United Nations, in 2012, it's the flooding that was the most destructive. Floods killed the most people, and they caused the most losses. Of natural disasters this year, more than half of the deaths in Asia were because of flooding. They're raising the flood walls here in Bangkok. Last year, there was massive flooding. The damage and the impact on the economy was huge. $45 billion in losses, the vast majority of that in the private sector, hitting businesses and people. And most of those people are poor, living in the most vulnerable areas.
All of these disasters in the past few years, a large proportion of the losses are actually borne by regular people, the farmers, the teachers, the policemen. So, and most of them get no support.
Asia's economy has been the one glimmer of hope in an increasingly gloomy global outlook. But continued poor preparation for natural disasters can quickly curb that growth.
So for the first time, it looks like growth rates themselves are a threat, and that brings attention to the finance ministers and leaders of countries, the importance of addressing natural disasters.
It's no mystery that Asia will continue to grow in population and continue to lead the way in building cities and businesses. Expansion, the UN says, needs to be done with an eye on reducing the exposure of vulnerable communities and businesses that drive the economy in these countries.
The problem that we have is that the cities are grown already. I mean, it's very difficult to undo the cities, right? Very difficult. But the future is still open. We know that in 20, 30 years, there's a lot more people going to be crowding in these cities. A lot more factories are going to be built. The question is, where are they going to be built?
And that's a question the governments of the region have to answer very carefully. Scott Heidler, Al Jazeera, Bangkok.
So what can Asian Pacific countries do to face disasters? To help answer this question, we're joined by a panel of guests. In Geneva, we have Margareta Wallström. She's Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. In Kuala Lumpur, we have Manu Gupta, Chair of the Asia Disaster Reduction and Response Network. And joining us via Skype from Slough, Helen Hodge, Associate Director at risk analysis company Maplecroft. Let's start with you, Manu, if we can. We're not just talking about theory here of reducing disasters. Right now, there are people suffering in the Philippines from a terrible storm there, a storm that took place in exactly the same place that there was a storm 12 months ago. Do you think anything was learnt from what happened a year ago?
No, I don't think we are learning fast enough because disasters are increasing in terms of their frequency and as well as their intensity, leaving very little room for us to take stock, review what went wrong last time. And this is what is worrying us the most. And this is becoming even more unpredictable by the day.
Helen, can I bring you in on the issue of the Philippines first and where those people are suffering after the storm that's taken place there? What's your assessment of the Philippines and what might have been learnt in 12 months or not learnt?
Sure. Well, the Philippines is very exposed to a number of different natural hazards. Clearly they're exposed to typhoons, as we're seeing at the moment, but they also have significant seismic risk and flooding risk, obviously partially associated with that typhoon risk. And one of the key challenges that we face, and indeed one of the key challenges that we actually measure in looking at natural hazards at Maplecroft, is that resilience component. And it's really that resilience component that is lacking in the Philippines. We see a country that is unfortunately repeatedly exposed to multiple disaster events, as you mentioned, exposed to a very similar event this time last year. There were significant floods back in August as well. And really the resilience factors, so factors like the sort of government organisation to manage and mitigate those events, really we don't see it as being a strong enough level to actually buffer the impacts that come from these natural hazards.
OK, let me bring in Margareta. I'd like to ask you, Margareta, also about the Philippines in a moment, but the UN is a complicated series of organisations. I think it might be useful first for you to explain your role, because you're not the person currently who's sending out blankets and shelter and food and medicine to the Philippines, are you? What's your job exactly?
Well, my job in the UN system, and in fact for the entire global system, is to advocate for, motivate and help to inspire, offer evidence for that investing in prevention and reducing future disaster risk really pays off. And to help us with that, we have an agreement that countries entered after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2005. Which is the Yoga Framework for Action, which is the guiding instrument that we use for our collaboration, but also for technical guidance.
So you're the person in the UN trusted by the Secretary-General. He's given you this job to look at how the UN and the world system deals with disaster and to see how it can be done better. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
OK, well, let's ask you about the Philippines. They had a terrible storm a year ago. They have another one now. Do you think they learned anything in 12 months?
Philippines has definitely learned something. 12 months ago, a little bit more than less than 12 months ago, I actually visited Mindanao, where the current storm also happened. And at that time, people said, local people, mayors and everyone, they said, oh, we don't really have any experience of this kind of typhoons because they usually don't hit us, which was very true. It had happened 50 years ago and 20 years ago, but people quickly forget. So thanks to our possibility to make this visit, other governors and mayors in the Philippines invited a very large group of 20 mayors of local governments from Mindanao to come and talk through their experiences from other more exposed parts of the Philippines. And thanks to that experience, the evidence is there now. There were, in fact, one town that had no casualties this time because the president went out and said, this time you have to evacuate, you have to listen to the early warning signals. The numbers of dead are too high, and the economic losses for many poor people are very high. But there is definitely a better performance this year than 1 year ago, and that's learning. And I think people, regrettably, will learn even faster after this year's typhoon.
Margareta, you said that the Philippines, the authorities there you met, said that that part of the world doesn't normally see typhoons like this. Why do you think things are changing, and do you think climate change could be a factor?
Certainly, there is great variability in weather and very likely some climate impact of this. But another factor in Mindanao, and it's not only Mindanao, many other parts of the world, is deforestation. What actually killed people last year in Mindanao was not very strong winds, but the fact that flash floods were generated by the rain, and they pulled down enormous amounts of logs and forests that were lying loose. And that's what wiped away and caused this effect that looked almost tsunami-like along the rivers. And the forest, the deforestation is a major threat. It contributes to make disasters worse.
OK, well, Margareta, if I can get
as you know.
If I can just get in there, please, Margareta, and give a little bit more context to our discussion. Let's take a look at which countries have suffered the most deaths from natural disasters over the last 20 years. Well, Haiti tops the list with almost 250,000 deaths. Most of them were people killed in the 7.0 magnitude earthquake in 2010. Indonesia comes second with around 185,000 deaths. The country was the epicenter of the 2004 earthquake and the tsunami, which was one of the worst natural disasters in history. Myanmar comes in third with almost 140,000 deaths. Among the disasters the country has faced was Cyclone Nargis in 2008. And China is number 4. It's hit by a severe earthquake in Sichuan province in 2008. And in 5th place, India, where natural disasters have killed over 100,000 people. Manu, those are the top 5. It is a little bit of a crude way to look at this subject, but 4 out of the 5 are in Asia. Why does Asia seem to be bearing the brunt of all this?
I mean, traditionally also, if you look at historical timelines, Asia has always had a bigger proportion of natural disasters hitting it. But what increases the problem here in terms of losses is the high population and therefore high levels of exposure. There's increased urbanization, there is high population densities along the coasts where these cyclones and tsunamis often hit, and that really increases the life loss.
Margareta, if I could bring in Manu, if I can bring in Margareta on this, because her organisation, her part of the UN, in their Asia office, have published some statistics. Their report that's out says that Asia is the world's most disaster-prone region. Obviously, it's also, Margareta, the most populous region. But what other reasons are there for Asia suffering so many natural disasters?
Also, I think in your readout of what were the main disasters, you mentioned earthquakes, 4 out of 5. And earthquakes anywhere in the world are the largest killer, and they cause enormous economic devastation. And of course, Asia has many highly seismic-prone, earthquake-prone regions. Japan is another one, of course. So that plus the second factor I like to mention that disasters and economic losses go along. That's the 2 fastest growing parameters that follow the same curve. And economic growth and disaster losses really follow each other in the design. So Asia, if you think about it, over the past 40 years has been the fastest growing region economically in the world. Fast urbanization, lots of infrastructure, and lots of exposure. People live in highly exposed coastlines where there is a huge population increase as well. So these are all factors that contribute to making the numbers high. But also look at the progress in how they managed in East Asia in particular to reduce the number of deaths in disasters. It's equally impressive.
Helen, I'd like to get your perspective on this. Some of what I've been reading bears out what we just heard from the UN representative, is that people are moving to new areas with economic development, to areas that are possibly more at risk.
Indeed, and I would very much agree with both of the other panelists here that much of that risk that we see is actually associated with where people are living and where people are moving to live. So whilst we see that obviously climate change and understanding future climate is going to be key, we really must understand that exposure component. So where are people living? Where are people moving to? We do see a very large pattern of urbanization across much of Asia. That is very relevant because it does mean that some of those key cities that are exposed, some of those coastal or riverine cities that are inherent risk exposure cities, that those now have larger populations. And that is perhaps even more significant if we look at the proportion of urban poor, in particular in those areas, who are often living in very poorly constructed houses, often on the most marginal lands. So, for example, being on floodplains. They're obviously going to be at more risk, but unfortunately those marginal lands are where people are forced to live. And indeed, the whole process of urbanization can further exacerbate.
OK, Manu, like to bring you in there just as the Skype stutters for a moment and ask you on that issue of people moving to new areas, urbanisation. Are the governments in these countries, are they doing enough to warn those people of the risks, to try and mitigate some of those risks? Manu?
You know, it's a vicious cycle, James. I mean, one of the we need to look at the causes that is pushing people from the rural hinterlands to urban areas. And again, you find climatic impacts that are reducing, you know, crop agricultural production, and therefore, you know, people having to look for alternate jobs, and that's pushing people to urban areas. So that's one. Second, if you know, as an answer to your question, I don't think governments are prepared to look at you know, the abnormally high level of urbanization that is taking place. I mean, in 2001, every fourth person in India was living in an urban area. Now that has come down to every third person in India living in an urban area. So that's the rate of urbanization in the second most populous country in the world. Likewise in many other Asian countries. So local governments, municipal governments are often overwhelmed, and you know, they cannot take such large influx of population moving into their cities.
OK, let's bring in Margareta on that. So you speak to national governments about these issues, but do you agree with Manu that some of the lessons that you're learning aren't getting down to local governments, to the grassroots communities?
You know, I work a lot with local governments as well, and they are all extremely well informed, and they know really where they have the risks. I think the challenge, as Manu already mentioned, is do they have the resources to tackle very concrete risks? Because you can also say that at local level, at local government level, that risks are most practically addressed immediately. But I also I am a bit more optimistic about urban areas than Manu. We have to look at why do people move to cities, not only because their livelihoods change, but in cities you can get better education, your jobs are normally higher paid, it's future life is in cities, and many experts today, in fact, would argue very strongly that living in cities, urban life, is the most cost-effective and most practical way to also address risks and some of the climate change impact risks that we are living. So I think we have to look at cities as a much more complex opportunity than just a threat for more disasters. It's true that the exposure increases, but probably also the solutions are within reach of cities if they would really choose to focus on them, and if they can mobilize resources, which I believe increasingly will be possible.
You've mentioned resources again. I suppose money is the most important one of those resources, but in an ideal world, what is needed now that you don't have right now?
Money for sure is important, but in many cities and local governments around the world, there's also issues of technical skills, that competence-based time, really ownership of land. Land is a critical issue to really legal perspectives on who's in charge of land. Most countries in the world have building codes. Are the building codes up to date? Does the local government and authorities have the possibility really to enforce them? Public education and awareness. Citizens must be involved in managing and reducing risk. Without citizen involvement, it cannot be done sustainably.
OK, Manu, I'd like to ask the same question to you. Transport you to utopia, an ideal world. What do we need now that we don't currently have?
I mean, to start with, I think we do certainly need better prediction systems. And, you know, one thing about climate change has been that, you know, we don't have enough downscaled data. to be able to come up with, exact projections. So I was speaking to a municipal engineer the other day, and he said, well, I know there is a climate change problem. I know there is a flooding issue in my city. But tell me what should be the diameter of the sewer line that the stormwater line that I should put in. And nobody's giving me that answer. That's what he said. So I agree with Margareta. It's not just a question of resources. It is the question of capacity. And the capacity includes information, timely and appropriate, and also the technical skills to be able to translate that information into better preparedness and improved resilience.
Helen, can I ask you, Manu, can I get Helen in there, please? Can I ask you, Helen, do you think new technology here can play a part? Can computer forecasting, modelling help us predict problems, and can new technology help us deal with problems?
I think new technology can deal with problems, and I think, it's certainly a tool that needs to be well adapted for the disaster risk community. I mean, for example, we see a lot of people with, say, mobile phones. That's a very powerful tool to warn people of a disaster approaching or a hazard approaching. So those are very important factors. One point that I would like to draw upon is some of these very economies that we're talking about in Asia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Myanmar, India, all of which are obviously seeing phenomenal economic growth rates at the moment. And for me, the key here is the ability to translate those phenomenal economic growth rates into the short-term gains which are needed to build a more resilient society. And I think the reason that we will increasingly see the world's focus coming on to Asia for these
Okay, we're losing you there, Helen. I'm going to bring in Manu on that one. Manu, do you think new technology can help us in any way? Because we are dealing with natural disasters, acts of God. There's no really to prevent these, is there, ever?
Absolutely. I mean, I think new technologies is doing a great good in our part of the world. Look at social media and how it helped inform communities in the Bangkok floods, some time ago. I think and the mobile connectivity, reaching out. Of course, there are problems, and we have seen that in past disasters, that when such catastrophic events happen, the mobile telephony network breaks down. But at the same time, that does not mean that, we do away with that. There are ways of, predicting and forewarning citizens about it. Also, I think as time is passing, we are getting much more accurate and timely information in terms of, as I said, downscale climate models.
Okay,
so,
Manu, if I
guess
can
technology
stop you
has
there
a
and bring in Margareta. Your job is predicting all of this for the UN. Can I ask you a question which might be a difficult one, but is there any big one that could be coming our way? Is there anything that keeps you up at night that you're particularly worried about?
Yes, and I'm sure many people with me share this fear of a major earthquake in one of the big economic financial centers in the world, what that would do to not only an already slightly fragile world economy, but also to a multi-million populated city, its hinterland, and the economy of that country.
For example, the west coast of the United States, if there was a massive earthquake there, for example.
Yes, hopefully that will not happen, but as you know, it is a seismic area. But just look at the impact of the Hurricane Sandy, where actually Wall Street shut down for 2 days, and New York City and even New Jersey had great difficulties with power supply, with transport. All the critical lifelines for a major urbanization are these facilities that keep us going. And if they are not functional, that's a great risk in itself.
OK, Margareta, thank you to all our guests, Margareta Wallström in Geneva, Manu Gupta in Kuala Lumpur and Helen Hodge from Slough. A thought-provoking discussion. But do you have views on this subject or any other topic? We want to know what we should discuss next. Please get in touch with us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.